On the Finest podcast, we cover the people, art, and movements redefining culture in San Diego, from Blink-182 to scrappy local bands. We also have cults, a lost composer, a world record traveler, and champion birders. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, San Diego. It's time for KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. On today's show, ballots are already being filled out for this year's midterm primary election, and there's more than just a governor to vote on for the June 2nd election. We take a closer look at some of the congressional races on the ballot this year, including the newly redrawn 48th district. Then, how prepared is the city of San Diego for a federal immigration enforcement blitz we've seen in other cities? Plus, new reporting found a big jump in e-bike accidents, many involving kids. We hear about efforts at the local and state levels to strengthen rules around a popular way to get around. That's all ahead on KPBS Roundtable. Voters should have their ballots for this year's primary election by now, and maybe you even had a chance to look over the more than 50 candidates for governor, but there are a lot of other races also on the ballot, including congressional races, and one is particularly getting a lot of attention. That's the race for the newly redrawn 48th district. Here to talk more about it is Jake Gatta. He is the public matters reporter here at KPBS. You may also see him on social media quite a bit, often riding his skateboard. Hey, Jake.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Glad you could join us today. So this district was redrawn as a result of Prop 50 that passed last year. Remind us what that did and how it changed the look of the 48th.
Yeah, so the 48th district was one of the Republican-held districts that was targeted by Prop 50. There was 5 of them in California, and the change that happened was we redrew these lines to affect the voter registrations in that district. So before Prop 50, there were more Republicans registered in the 48th district. Now there's more Democrats registered in that district, and that's really changing the calculus for who's running and for how likely Democrats are to win that seat and pick up another blue seat for their congressional race.
But, even with these new borders, it's not what I think a lot of people would consider a true blue district, right? It still has a fair share of Republicans.
Oh, yeah. There's still a good amount of Republicans, and voter registration numbers aren't everything. There's plenty of people who aren't necessarily registered with either party and who are going to pick one way or the other. They don't tell the whole story, and then there's a pretty strong candidate still coming out of the Republican side. So Darrell Issa, the current representative who holds that seat, he's choosing to retire rather than run for re-election in this redrawn district. But he made
that announcement after it was, right?
Yes. After the Prop 50 passed, there was a few weeks or months there where nobody really knew. There's actually some suggestion that he would move to Texas and run in Texas and try and take a Republican or Democratic seat there after they redrew their map. That didn't pan out. He decided to not run for re-election. He announced he's retiring for a second time. And he endorsed County Supervisor Jim Desmond as his replacement.
Yeah, so let's talk more about his candidacy and what he's been, saying on the campaign trail.
Yeah, well, I mean, Supervisor Desmond is pretty popular among his supporters in sort of East County and North County. I mean, he's been elected to be a supervisor. He's been the standard bearer for Republican governance at the county level on a lot of issues. And as he's running to represent this district, he's sort of running the same line. He's saying a lot of the same things about how the government is getting in the way and about how we need to cut regulations and we need to cut taxes. I actually tried pretty hard to get an interview with him, and he didn't respond to multiple requests for that. So didn't get a chance to ask him these questions, and I would be more than happy to. But yeah, his campaign website is pretty standard. We want to cut taxes, we want to cut regulations, and we want to get the government out of the way for businesses especially.
So you weren't able to speak with County Supervisor Jim Desmond, as you mentioned, but you did get a chance to chat with several of the Democratic candidates running, right? So let's talk about two of the more well-known candidates. That's Amar Campa-Najjar and Marnie von Wilpert. Tell us about them and, what they're saying.
Yeah, Councilmember Marty Von Wilpert, she's a city council member here in San Diego. She flipped a red district blue when she ran for city council. I'm pretty sure she beat Carl DeMaio actually in that race, but don't quote me on that. But she won her district and has been city council person for a number of years, and now she's running to represent the 48th, and she's really leaning on a lot of her experience and governance in the city council to say, we're going to do the same things that I've been doing at city council. We're going to bring that to the national level. And like a lot of the other candidates, her focus has really been on affordability and the cost of living here in San Diego and in California in general.
Yeah, and I want to talk more into that, but talk more about that in just a moment. But, the other candidates getting a lot of attention, Amar Campa-Najjar, tell us about him and his candidacy.
Yeah, Amar Campa-Najjar is a familiar name in San Diego politics in recent years. He's run a couple other campaigns to try and win a couple different races. He ran against Darrell Issa and lost. He ran against Duncan Hunter in that same district a few years before that. And he ran for mayor of Chula Vista and didn't win that one. But so he's took a crack at winning these elections a couple times now. He's ran for Congress a couple times, and so he does have experience in that area, and he's trying to get over the hump for the first time here with this election.
Well, there are more candidates on the Democratic side. I mean, what can you tell us about another candidate, Karina Contreras?
So she's a Vista City Council member as well. She's running a lot on the same messages of affordability. One of the things that she mentioned, though, that was interesting is she has a real focus on transit-oriented development. And that's also kind of unique for a district and a region that's not necessarily super transit-oriented. And I think that's kind of what she's saying is that we need to invest in better transit for these regions that are, lacking. And then the way to not only do that and pay for it, but to support that transit in the long term is to build lots of housing nearby it. So the people who live in those homes can take transit and they don't have to rely on a car. That supports our transit agencies also because then they're going to have more revenue and things like that. So yeah, one of the things that she mentioned was this focus on putting federal dollars into not just incentivizing, but actually building housing near transit, building more transit projects, building housing near it, and then using those two different things to support each other.
Interesting. There's also Brandon Riker. Tell us more about him. And you got a chance to talk with him as well, right?
Yeah. I interviewed Brandon Riker. He, again, focused on affordability. That was really just the key message from all of these people that I interviewed about or in this race. And so Brandon Riker is an economist. He has raised a lot of money from himself. He's donated a lot of his own money to this campaign. He's a pretty wealthy individual, and I think he's donated close to or more than $1 million to his own campaign. So he has plenty of money to run, and his plans that he's talking about, one of them is pretty unique actually as well. He was talking about how you can address Social Security taxes, and so we all pay Social Security taxes on our wages. There's apparently a cap at $184,000. So after that, you no longer pay taxes on your Social Security or Social Security taxes on your wages. Mm-hmm. So he wants to get rid of that cap and address, Social Security's long-term solvency in that way by, making sure that it's going to have more money down the line to continue to pay out. But at the same time, he wants to raise like a floor to the first $50,000 on your wages, so you don't pay taxes on those. And so that would be like a pretty significant boost of money back into a worker's pocket every paycheck, because it's cutting that tax right at the paycheck level, not that you pay back. It's not a tax benefit. It's not like a voucher.
Something you have to file for
right,
or something.
Yeah. It would just, every worker would just be getting, he says, about a 6% raise on their paycheck, everybody who's making up to $184,000. And so that would be a pretty significant way to put money back into a worker's pocket and also pay for it by, taxing the rich, which is kind of one of the common Democratic themes is like more taxes on the wealthy, put more money back into workers' pockets.
Right, and we're seeing billionaires' tax potentially being on the right.
Yeah, that was and that was what Amar Kampanajjar had mentioned as well. I mean, he spoke about a wealth tax. He spoke about using that money to invest in our schools and our roads and our communities, and it's really becoming a common theme among Democratic politicians is to not shy away from this idea of taxing the rich, taxing, the wealthy, taxing the powerful, taxing corporations especially, and trying to use that money to invest in our society.
So as you mentioned a couple times the word affordability, it seems to be the top issue in this race, like a lot of others we're seeing. But you touched on this a little bit, but tell us more about how some of the candidates are looking to tackle that specifically, because they have different ideas here.
Yeah. We can go back to Councilmember Marnie von Wilpert. She had a pretty interesting idea for her way of tackling this affordability issue, specifically with affordable housing, and it leans on her experience at the city council.
Okay, so we're going to come back to that clip in just a second.
Okay.
We'll talk about. But basically focusing on affordable housing, bringing that to the national level.
Yeah, and the permitting process therein, because there's only so much man hours and staff hours that like the permitting department at the city council or at the city can do, like the planning department, all of these things that are obstacles to building housing that go beyond just financing and go beyond, paying for it or incentivizing it or even zoning it, is just the time it takes to get a permit approved for building any sort of housing, any sort of development. It can take a long time, and that time just adds up and builds on the cost of building it, which, that cost gets passed on to consumers. So what Councilmember von Wilpert said is that what they've done at the city council here in San Diego is jump affordable housing developers to the front of the line. So
we have that clip now, so let's
cool.
hear a little bit from Marnie. This is Marnie von Wilpert.
We need to prioritize building actual affordable housing in this country. We've done that at the San Diego City Council. We did the Affordable Housing Now permit, where we put affordable developers to the front of the permit line and made sure we actually got them through our bureaucracy quicker so they can get back to the business of building housing. We're going to do the same thing in Congress.
Yeah, now, as I was saying, that's an approach that's not rooted in like, oh, we need to pass some big tax increase or we need to, invest federal dollars in this place or that place, which there's a place for that, of course. But this is a way to address this housing supply crunch without having to do much besides change the way that we're approving permits, change the way that we're approaching who gets to get to the front of the line when we're building stuff. And Councilmember von Wilpert says if you're building affordable housing that's deed restricted and it's going to be, reserved for lower income people, you should get your approvals first. You should be the one that gets reviewed first. And then that way you can speed up that process and speed up the timeline for building so that not only do we get those units faster, but they're cheaper too. They don't cost as much to build.
You also spoke about this issue with Amar Kampanajjar. You talked a little bit about some of his ideas, but tell us more about this, how he's looking at this affordability issue.
Yeah, so he mentioned taxes, and he mentioned plugging those resources back into our community. And yeah, that's something that, again, like I mentioned before, it's becoming more commonly accepted that if we want to have good schools, good roads, good, things that governments pay for, that tax money has to come from somewhere. And we're looking at different ways to find that. A lot of people are saying maybe we should tax the wealthy, tax the rich a little bit more. And Amar Kampanajjar mentioned a wealth tax and using that money to invest in all those different things. Now, how likely is that to get passed through Congress, especially through a Congress that may not have a friendly Senate, so a House that may not have a friendly Senate, a House that might be split by 1 or 2 votes? It's unclear. That would be a little bit different or a little bit more difficult of a lift, I think, than something like a regulatory change with affordable housing permitting. So it's something that would certainly create a lot of revenue for the government that could go towards all these different things that he's mentioned, but it's also just something that, we have to see what the appetite is for new taxes in 7 months or 6 months when this new Congress takes control. And it might not even be a Democratic-controlled Congress. That's still not for sure at all with the way that these legislative redistricting battles have been playing out.
But you bring up a really interesting point, I think, which is, getting something done at the local, county, maybe state level is much different than, I don't know, I think, so many people have a common frustration just by the amount of gridlock in Washington, D.C. Like, what can you actually do, right?
Right. No, totally. And I mean, that's why we did Prop 50 here in California in the first place. Like, it was really about beyond just the back and forth with Texas and other states doing their redistricting and the political games there. People in California finally had a chance to impact that calculus, that national level of, how are we actually going to get a Congress that works for us, that does the things that we as a nation want it to do. A lot of times people in California sort of feel left out of this national conversation because, like, we're sort of written off as it's all blue. Like, guaranteed it's never really, blue, guaranteed blue. We always vote for a Democrat for the president. And then, like, we have 2 Democratic senators. They're never really, like, the,
center of the...
Right. They're never really, like, the focal point of the senators because they're always pretty reliably voting with the Democrats. It's not like Joe Manchin or Sinema who, like, maybe would vote with the Republicans sometimes. And so then they're the vote that you need to get. But so because of all that, a lot of times Californians are like, hey, we did everything we could. We voted for the people we voted for, and we still don't really have any say in this national conversation. And Prop 50 was a way for us to have a big say in that national conversation and say what the people voted for here in California is more Democrats in Congress. And now we have to go vote again to follow that, to see that through. But they voted for that because people in California want to see our representatives leading on the national stage and going to D.C., going to Congress and saying, no, this is what we're going to do. We're going to actually accomplish this and, try and make what California is pushing for actually come to reality.
So we have about a minute left. I do want to just, get your it's not the only congressional race, happening in our region. Can you tell us a little bit about a couple of the other races? They're not as competitive as this one.
Yeah. There's a couple other, I mean, that the 48th district is the only district in San Diego, the only congressional district in San Diego County that was not held by a Democrat. So there's 4 other Democrats who are going to be defending their seats. Sarah Jacobs, Juan Vargas, Scott Peters, and Mike Levin are all incumbents in pretty favorable Democratic districts, which means they're pretty likely to win re-election here. That's just the way these things work. And so they're not really campaigning all that much, and there's not really any strong opposition to them as well. It's not something that a statewide or national Republican Party would want to invest a lot of money in, is trying to go uphill against a guy like Scott Peters or a representative like Sarah Jacobs who has, lots of support, lots of money, and a pretty strong Democratic-friendly district.
Well, Jake, thanks so much for breaking this down for us. There's still a lot to talk about, and we'll probably have you on hopefully after the primary to talk more about it. You can always find out more on the primary election at our voter guide at kpbs.org/voter guide. Jake Gatta is Public Matters reporter here at KPBS. Jake, thanks again.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Up next, how ready is San Diego for a major federal immigration blitz? We hear about reporting looking into how prepared the city is to face that potential. You're listening to KPBS Roundtable. Welcome back to KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. How prepared is San Diego for a large-scale immigration crackdown, like ones we've seen in L.A. or Minneapolis? Immigration advocacy groups were hopeful when Mayor Todd Gloria signed an executive order last July that called for a joint safety plan. But nearly 1 year later, advocates argue there's been a lack of transparency there. That's happening as new data released this week revealed over 16,000 people have been apprehended by ICE in the county between January 2025 and April of this year. Here with more is KPBS investigative border reporter Gustavo Solis. Hey, Gustavo.
Hey, Andrew. How you doing?
Good to have you back.
Thank you.
I think today we wanted to center this conversation, on immigration, on this idea of transparency, or, where we are with that. Mm-hmm. And I want to start with your reporting on the recent arrests of cruise workers in San Diego. It seems to be part of something called Operation Tidal Wave. Tell us more about that story.
Yeah, that story came about. I mean, the arrest happened a while ago, April 23rd and April 25th, the ones we were aware of. And advocates behind the scenes spent the last couple weeks reaching out to Border Patrol, reaching out to the Port of San Diego, trying to find information about who these men are, why they were detained, whether they have access to attorneys, just trying to figure out what was happening. So they set up a press conference at the Port of San Diego. We all went over there and then just kind of raised these concerns to the public. Then the next day, ICE and Border Patrol came out with a press release finally releasing more information about Operation Tidal Wave, claiming that the people arrested, about 26 people arrested, were involved in child pornography. They either had or shared or produced child pornographic images. And that helped answer some of the questions, but it also raised a whole slew of new questions.
Yeah, so let's talk more about where do you go from there? Yeah, what questions do you have from that story now?
Yeah, well, we know from the Philippine consulate that some of the people have already been deported, right? So the obvious question is, hey, if you have a bunch of people engaged in this really serious crime, why are you deporting them before they have a chance to be charged, prosecuted,
put in the criminal
convicted?
justice system? Yeah.
Right, and if they are, like, if they are guilty of what they're accused of being, why would you just let them go back to their home country with no criminal consequences? Is there justice for the victims? Did investigators have a chance to figure out if this was part of a broader network, or were they deported too quickly before that, right? Even basic details about the arrest, ICE and Border Patrol statement contradict each other. ICE said 23 people were arrested. Border Patrol said 27. Which one is it? We don't know for sure. The names of the individuals, we don't know for sure. I did reach out to both federal prosecutors in Los Angeles and San Diego. They have no knowledge of pending charges, prosecutions, or anything like that. So at least locally, there's nothing showing that these people are facing criminal charges for the horrible things they're accused of.
And as you mentioned there, I mean, just even basic facts have been pretty hard for you to kind of confirm here.
The number of people involved, yeah. Or even the names, right? If you look at DHS's social media presence, they are full of mugshots of the names of the people and crimes they're accused of. But in this instance, nothing until after the advocates raised the concerns and local media wrote stories about it.
So I imagine you're still digging into that story. What's next for you? What are you looking at next?
Tough to say. I mean, I'll continue checking with prosecutors, see if anything has come about. I believe Border Patrol kind of hinted that all of them have already been deported back home. So then it just kind of what happens with Operation Tidal Wave, right? Let's remember that the immigration system is a civil system, and child pornography is a criminal offense. Why are you using a civil justice system to adjudicate a criminal offense? We have a criminal system for that. So I think that's a bigger question.
So, this week, ICE released data on the number of apprehensions in the region. Tell us more about what we learned.
Yeah, continuing on the theme of transparency, right? Yeah. This is data that members of Congress had to ask for, specifically, every Democrat that represents San Diego, I believe it was spearheaded by Congressman Levin, formally requesting information about who in San Diego is being arrested and deported, including their nationality and their criminality.
And it's also the number of people arrested by ICE in specific locations kind of became a piece of that.
Yeah, that was a big one that we didn't have before, that little piece of information, right, that hadn't been reported on before until these members of Congress asked for it. And it was pretty interesting. I believe the numbers were about 1,400 individuals arrested at or near sensitive locations. Sensitive locations are schools, hospitals, and churches. And that's been a real point of contention during the second Trump administration, because historically we don't do enforcement in those places. And I think we have a little bit of soundbite from Congressman Scott Peters on this issue.
I think the really cool thing is that you're picking up people who are going to church or going to school, going to hearings where they're trying to comply with the law. the legal process we've set out.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, the big concern is the aftershock of that, right? If there is one arrest in a school, that tells the entire community to maybe avoid schools, right? We have anecdotal and even some hard data of attendance being down because of these operations in sensitive locations, and that's the concern. Well, there's multiple layers of concern here, but that's one of the big ones is it impacts the entire community in a way that other types of operations in non-sensitive locations do not.
So similar to what we were just talking about with, the cruise workers and what's happening there, a lot more questions coming out for you, I'm sure, about this data. What questions are you asking next from this?
Well, one of the big ones still remaining, which is a question originally proposed by the members of Congress to ICE when they asked for this information in the first place, was criminality, right? We know 16,000 people have been deported from the region. How many of them have criminal convictions? How many just pending charges? How many have no criminal convictions at all? And that's been a big theme throughout the Trump administration, right? I've been on here before saying, contrary to what the administration is saying, that they're going after the worst of the worst, their own data shows that well over 70% of the people impacted by this have no criminal record. So that is still another big question.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the city and their plan for, how to handle the potential of a large-scale immigration blitz. Remind us what the mayor's executive order was designed to do.
Yeah, so this is back from July of last year. San Diego Mayor Todd Gloria signed an executive order that does a lot of things. Some are immediate, hosting Know Your Rights workshops around town, providing information in multiple languages in municipal buildings like libraries and City Hall, and just being a little bit more vocal about what resources are available. Like, those are good things. It also made a couple of lofty promises, right? The mayor is going to convene a special task force and is going to come up with a joint safety plan. The mayor is going to convene a regional roundtable meeting with every mayor and police chief in the county to go over what their response is going to look like. They're going to meet with local stakeholders like nonprofits to evaluate policies and come up with recommendations. And I spent the last 3 months trying to get specifics about some of those issues, right? How many groups have you met with? What is the joint strategic plan? Like, what do you plan to do if and when ICE comes to San Diego? I mean, just this week, Tom Homan said mass deportations are still on. And it's been very hard to get any concrete details about any of those questions. I mean, as part of the reporting process, I filed public records requests asking for minutes, agendas, memos, any documents related to a plan, and none of those were made available.
You mentioned, this part of it is meeting with immigration service providers. Like, has that been happening?
It has, but we don't know how many or with who, right? The mayor's office declined to give me a list or share any of the organizations, except one, Jewish Family Service, which is a great organization. They've been around for a long time, doing a lot of good work in this space. And they confirmed that they're working with the mayor as a sort of like an expert guide. But I talked to other organizations who haven't met with the mayor's office. One of them, the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium, is not one organization, but a group of more than 50 organizations that have a lot of expertise, institutional knowledge, direct relationships with the immigrant populations. And they're saying, like, hey, we could be a great resource to partner with you on this, but we're not getting any really collaboration.
So what are some of the concerns that they'd be raising if they were able to, talk with city officials? What are you hearing from immigrant rights?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit hard to say because they don't know what the plan is right now, right? The city, as the city did tell me they have a plan in place. It is adaptive. It's subject to change. It's not a static document, and it's a set of coordinated protocols and rules and response actions. But beyond that, we don't know what those policies and protocols are. So the groups have no way of really providing input in that. I think one of the gentlemen I talked to, Pedro Rios from American Friends Service Committee, he kind of summed it up as, well, we can hear from him directly and then we'll talk about it.
There's a perception that the mayor's office hasn't done enough and isn't as interested on these issues. And even though he might, and his office might say that they are working on this issue, it's not as clearly transparent. Hasn't been clearly communicated to the wider public.
Right, so there he is again speaking of transparency and communication. And he said that it is a good strategy for the city to have an adaptive plan because ICE tactics change, so you want to be able to adapt to it. But the fact that you're not talking about it and being fully transparent creates this perception that, we don't know what's going on.
So another piece of this is there's this, kind of protections at the state level, right? And this California Values Act, which came into effect a few years ago. What can you tell us about that and how that plays into, what San Diego may or may not be planning?
For that story, I thought it was really interesting it's a fact that the mayor's executive order doesn't operate in a vacuum, and it's not the only policy aimed at limiting immigration enforcement in San Diego. State law, California Values Act, is passed after the Trump administration. It kind of sets the groundwork for what the protections are, what police officers can and cannot do. And everything after that, whether it's a new ordinance that recently passed in the city of San Diego is going to go into effect this month, or the mayor's executive order, build up on that. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic, right? Because the law passed during the first Trump administration, some parts of it are a little bit outdated because of new tactics that we're seeing in Trump 2.0. I spoke with Erin Tsurumoto Grassi. She's with San Diego Alliance, and she kind of talked about the dynamic of how these different laws and policies work together.
It was groundbreaking. It still is. There's still states that don't have what we have here, and they are rushing to be able to get what we have and have had since 2017. And then it has limitations because what we're seeing now is different than what we were seeing in 2017.
Interesting. So, you touched on one thing. You mentioned, in addition to the mayor's executive order, council member Shawnee Rivera introduced a new city ordinance that is set to go into effect.
Right.
How is that different? Explain that to us really quickly.
It builds on what the mayor was doing in some ways. An example would be police reports, right? The mayor's office, the mayor's executive order said that the police department has to report any SDPD activity whenever they respond to a 911 ICE-related call, whether that be the agency calling for kind of crowd control or individuals like citizens calling ICE. The executive order doesn't formalize what those reports look like, and it doesn't require them to be made public. I had to put in a records request. It took me 3 months to get them. They're text messages. They have good information, but they're just not accessible to the public. What the ordinance does is it formalizes the reporting process, and it requires the police department to submit it to the city council within 3 days. So hopefully that provides another layer of just transparency.
Yeah. Again, back to the theme of the day.
Yeah.
Okay, as we finish up here, we have about a minute left, Gustavo. And I'm just wondering, touched on a few different stories here. I know you're probably working on another one right now. How do all these stories you've been involved with this week tie together to tell us the larger picture of immigration in San Diego right now?
It's still happening, right? It's not going away. People are still on edge. And I think people are just trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. I view the role of a reporter, well, there's multiple roles, but one of that I appreciate is the reporter as an educator. And education really has a way to reduce anxiety, right? You arm yourself with knowledge, and, fear comes from uncertainty, right? So the more you know about something, the less uncertain you are, the more you feel like you have agency over it. And I think, after a year and a half of this administration, people are still anxious and stressed and tired, and they're looking for information and transparency and communication as a way to combat that.
I want to thank you so much for joining us and to kind of breaking some of this down. Gustavo Solis is investigative border reporter here at KPBS. Gustavo, thanks as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Coming up, new reporting found a big rise in e-bike accidents. We hear more about it next. You're listening to KPBS Roundtable. Welcome back to KPBS Roundtable. I'm Andrew Bracken. Over the past few years, electric bicycles have become a popular way for young people to get around. They make quite a bit of sense here in San Diego. They provide a way for them to gain more independence, maybe get off screens, get outdoors, as well as to better navigate San Diego's hillier neighborhoods. But the data say that popularity has come with the costs. Accidents involving e-bikes are also on the rise. In fact, they've quadrupled over the past half-decade. Here to talk more about it is Kate Murphy. She's a reporter with Axios San Diego. Hey, Kate, great to have you here.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to be here.
So we've been hearing about, this surge in popularity of e-bikes, right? And particularly around young people. I think it's a common sight to see them on our streets. But that has led to more concerns about accidents and injuries. You dug into the data here. What did you all find?
Yeah, so, just having kind of witnessed it myself as, on the roads and just seeing more and more people out there, I wanted to see the numbers on what the crashes actually looked like in San Diego, particularly as the city is kind of considering new rules and regulations around it. And so, we found, over the past 5 years that collisions involving e-bikes have quadrupled, and is interesting because the data from San Diego Police Department, looks at all kinds of bike-involved collisions, and we kind of had to narrow that down ourselves and analyze that in looking at which ones of these involve e-bikes specifically based on the brands or just like different classifications in that data. They've gone up consistently year over year, and it's interesting to see kind of where a lot of them are happening in the, coastal neighborhoods like Pacific Beach and Mission Beach. Those were kind of the hot spots locally. And, a lot of in addition to the crashes themselves, like a lot of them were happening with unsafe speeds and, unsafe turns were kind of the most frequent violations that were accompanying those crashes.
Yeah, and you had to do some extra homework here, right? Like, tell us more about just the process of finding this data. As you mentioned, it's not just super clear cut of what's an e-bike.
Yeah, so we filed a public records request to get we originally asked for e-bike data on e-bike involved incidents, and we got back this big data set from the police department that was all bicycle related crashes, and there isn't like a particular column that identifies this as an e-bike incident. And so we kind of had to do our own analysis looking at popular e-bike brands. In a lot of the incidents, there wasn't a brand or like a vehicle make listed. And certainly a lot of brands also make regular bikes and e-bikes. So we excluded those from this sort of analysis, and as well as trying to take out ones that were more like mopeds or electric motorbikes, which, are really more like motorcycles on the road versus like the ones you're thinking of, like the pedal assist that we're seeing a lot more of. So, it was really interesting to kind of dig into that and just wanted to try to get a more clear picture on what the numbers actually are behind this.
But I mean, what you're describing there, it kind of tells the story of e-bikes and the larger kind of landscape of all these like portable, these electric things we see kind of going around. And it can get really confusing. And I think that's, a big part of it. E-bikes are not all one size fits all, right? They're different. They're 3 different classes. Can you just remind us the breakdown there?
Yeah. So there's type 1, type 2, and type 3. And basically they're just kind of like different iterations of an e-bike, and they can have different speeds. Certainly some bikes are like one-person bikes that sometimes you see 2 people riding on, and other ones have like 2 seats and that sort of thing. So, it seems like cities are really trying to target those type 1 and type 2 class bikes that are, have those lower speeds and aren't really those like, they still go up to 20 miles per hour.
Right.
And other ones like up to 28 miles per hour. But
just so like the class 1, I think, doesn't have the throttle, but it does. It kind of boosts you, gives you the extra boost.
Yeah.
And then 2 does have a throttle, but it's capped at 20 miles an hour.
Yes.
And then the third one, I think, can go up to has the throttle plus to 28.
Yeah.
Which is,
that's
fast.
like a car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, obviously, the big issue here is the injuries that have come along with it. I mean, what makes e-bike injuries, especially with kids, particularly concerning for doctors right now?
Yeah, so Rady Children's Hospital had a recent, pretty big study looking at how these injuries are becoming more prevalent and more severe with kids coming into their ERs. And, a big part of it is that speed that's just making them a more serious collision or accident, whether it's with another vehicle or just, hitting a rock or a sidewalk crack that sends you flying over the handlebars. That looks much different, has a much greater impact when it's on an electric bike going 20 miles per hour than, your standard pedal bike. And so, that's what it sounds like is really concerning these trauma surgeons and doctors in the ER that are just seeing much more, severe injuries like we saw this past weekend with, a 12-year-old boy had a broken collarbone and brain bleed that required surgery. And, it was these are life-threatening injuries that are coming from these e-bikes or kids riding these e-bikes as opposed to, just getting scraped up. They're heavier, even just having it fall on you is a much more
heavier,
painful experience than a regular pedal bike.
So we have seen several cities in the county, make efforts, pass local ordinances to make rules around e-bikes and kids recently. Tell us more about those efforts, and then we'll dive into what the city of San Diego is doing here.
Yeah, so there was a state law passed that kind of enabled local San Diego County cities to join in on this pilot program that essentially was a framework for how they can regulate e-bikes. And so we've seen, La Mesa, Carlsbad, Oceanside, San Marcos, Encinitas, and others adopt these new rules and regulations limiting their use, particularly for kids under 12. That's kind of the big target right now is elementary school kids mostly. And, it's interesting to see there's age limits, passenger limits. Some are looking at confiscating e-bikes and banning them from sidewalks. And so it's really this patchwork of different laws and policies that individual cities are trying to just adopt themselves. The city of San Diego is the most recent one that's considering it, which are looking at, the restriction or banning it for kids under 12, and then also banning you from having a passenger unless there's a seat dedicated for that individual. And so they're looking at picking that up this summer after the budget is
and trying to get it. If it could get passed before next school year.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They're hoping to have it in effect for next school year, and really focusing on kind of the education piece around it versus having a lot of infractions, but they're really focused on, how can we educate kids to ride these safely?
And there just seemed to be sort of a catching up sort of feel to some of these efforts. And then there are multiple bills right now at the state level looking to regulate e-bikes. Tell us more about those and what those are, aiming to do.
Yeah, so state lawmakers are looking at a number of different laws or bills to get passed. One would require DMV registration, and then others kind of look at how they're limiting essentially how businesses can market and sell them and what how they're defined and
well,
what
that goes back to what you were saying about
parents.
the difference between the e-bikes, the classes, but then there are the e-moto, what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a lot of people can get confused by that.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of times parents don't really know what they're buying. They don't know the full capability. You just think, oh, this is an accessible, easy thing that can help my kid get around, get to school, and then you don't have to drive them anymore. But there's, I think, again, part of that education process of what you're actually buying and the capabilities of these vehicles themselves, which they really are vehicles.
Yeah. At the end of your story on e-bikes, you reached out to your readers to get their thoughts. I'm just curious, what type of responses, what's been the sentiment that you've heard?
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear, some have shared their experiences of their kid who was seriously injured, kind of not knowing what he was getting into when, getting on this bike, and even, as a grown adult or a young adult, and just the serious injuries that can kind of come from it that are really unexpected, as well as kind of on the other end of the spectrum, you know, a lot of older folks and like seniors thinking about, okay, this could help me navigate my life better, and heard concerns on that end as well, like how, you know, not just for kids, but for older adults, like, and again, navigating those streets and the fear around how dangerous really are these things, and thinking about putting a loved one out there on the road on these e-bikes.
Yeah, and again, also the big factor is just coexisting with cars, right? And it just seems to fit really well with some of our transportation needs. But, you know, a lot of these accidents probably the majority were with accidents with cars, I imagine, right? So a lot to follow there, but it's really interesting reporting, and I want to thank you for joining us. I've been speaking with Kate Murphy, reporter with Axios San Diego. Kate, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That'll do it for Roundtable this week. Thanks so much for listening, and to all my guests today. If you have any thoughts on today's show, you can always email us at roundtable@kpbs.org. You can also leave us a message at 619-452-0228. Roundtable's technical producer is Brandon Trufa. The show was produced by Juliana Domingo. Brooke Ruth is Roundtable's senior producer. I'm your host, Andrew Bracken. Have a great Mother's Day weekend. It's hard to ignore that childhood has changed in a lot of ways, and one of the most striking reasons is the role technology is playing in it. From the NPR network and KPBS, this is Screen Time, a podcast featuring conversations about technology and kids in today's digital age. Listen to Screen Time wherever you get your podcasts.